Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. As I mentioned before, The Way to Wealth by Benjamin Franklin is a big and powerful book. That's why we're exploring it part by part. And today, you're watching part 2 of this amazing journey towards success and wisdom. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, make sure to check it out first, because in that video, we covered the foundation of Franklin's timeless money principles. You'll find the link in the description or at the top of this video. Now, let's continue uncovering the life-changing lessons from this classic masterpiece and see how Franklin's ideas can still guide us toward real wealth, even today. Part 2, on the great design of nature's teaching and the methods she employs in carrying it on. Chapter 1, a comprehensive view of the several educational processes carried on by nature. We have seen in the former chapters that the most probable method of succeeding in any difficult undertaking is to learn from nature and to endeavor to imitate her. The first great question with the educationist then should be, does nature ever teach? If he can find her so employed, and if he be really willing to learn, he may rest assured that by carefully studying her operations, he will be able to detect something in the ends which she aims at and the methods which she adopts for attaining these ends that will lead him to the selection of similar means and crown him ultimately with similar success. Now we find that nature does teach, and insofar as rational beings are concerned, whether angelic or human, it appears to be her chief and her noblest employment. In regard to the human family, she no doubt, at a certain period, intends that the task should be taken up and carried on by parents and teachers under her control. But when we compare the nature and success of their operations with hers, we perceive the immense inferiority of their best endeavors and are obliged to confess that in many instances, instead of forwarding her work, they either mar or destroy it. For in regard to the matter of page 38, their teaching, it may be observed that they can teach their pupils nothing except what they or their predecessors have learned of nature before. And as to the manner in which it is taught, it is generally so very imperfect that for their success, teachers are often indebted in no small degree to the constant interference of nature in what is ordinarily termed the common sense of their pupils for rectifying many of their errors and supplying innumerable deficiencies. Of this we shall by have to advert more particularly. The educational operations of nature are universal, and she attaches large rewards to diligence in attending to them. She evidently intends, as we have said, that the parent and teacher should take up and follow out her suggestions in this great work. But even when this is delayed or altogether neglected, her part of the proceedings is not abandoned. Nature is so strong within the pupil, and her educational promptings are so powerful, that even without a teacher, he is able for a time to teach himself. In man, and even among many of the more perfect specimens of the lower creation, nature has suspended the larger portion of their comforts and their security upon attention to her lessons and the practical application of that which she teaches. The dog which shuns the person who had previously beaten him, the infant that clings to its nurse and refuses to leave her, the boy who refuses to cross the ditch he never tried before, the savage who traces the footprints of his game, the man who shrinks from a ruffian countenance, and Newton, when the fall of an apple prompted him to pursue successively the lessons which that simple event suggested to him, are all examples of the teachings of nature, specimens of the manner in which she enables her pupils to collect and retain knowledge, and stimulates them to apply it. Wherever these suggestions of nature are individually neglected, there must be discomfort, page 39, and danger and wretchedness to the person doing so. And wherever they are not taken up by communities and socially taught by education of some kind or another, society must necessarily remain little better than savage. The opposite of this is equally true, for wherever they are personally attended to, the individual promotes his own safety and comfort, and when they are socially taken up and followed out by education, however imperfectly, then civilization and national security, prosperity, and happiness are the invariable consequences. The information which we are to derive from the Academy of Nature is to be found chiefly in those instances where she is least interfered with by the operations of others. In these we shall endeavor to follow her, And by classifying her several processes and investigating each of them in its order, we shall assuredly be able to arrive at some first principles to guide us in imitating the modes of her working, and which will enable us, in some measure, to share in her success. When we take a comprehensive view of the educational processes of nature, we find them arranging themselves under four great divisions, blending into each other, no doubt, like the kingdoms of nature and the colors of the rainbow, but still perfectly distinct in their great characteristics. The first educational process, which is observable in Nature's Academy, is the stimulating of her pupil to such an exercise of mind upon external objects as tends powerfully and rapidly to expand and strengthen the powers of his mind. This operation begins with the first dawning of consciousness and continues under different forms during the whole period of the individual's life. The second educational process, which in its commencement is perhaps coeval with the first, is nature's stimulating her pupil to the acquisition of knowledge, for the purpose of retaining and using it. Page 40. The third consists in the disciplining of her pupil in the practical use and proper application of the knowledge received, by which means the knowledge itself becomes better understood, better remembered, and much more at the command of the will than it was before. And her fourth educational process consists in training her pupil to acquire facility in communicating by language, his knowledge and experience to others. The information which we are to derive from the Academy of Nature is to be found chiefly in those instances where she is least interfered with by the operations of others. In these we shall endeavor to follow her, and by classifying her several processes and investigating each of them in its order, we shall assuredly be able to arrive at some first principles to guide us in imitating the modes of her working, and which will enable us, in some measure, to share in her success. When we take a comprehensive view of the educational processes of nature, we find them arranging themselves under four great divisions, blending into each other, no doubt, like the kingdoms of nature and the colors of the rainbow, but still perfectly distinct in their great characteristics. The first educational process, which is observable in Nature's Academy, is the stimulating of her pupil to such an exercise of mind upon external objects as tends powerfully and rapidly to expand and strengthen the powers of his mind. This operation begins with the first dawning of consciousness and continues under different forms during the whole period of the individual's life. The second educational process, which in its commencement is perhaps coeval with the first, is nature's stimulating her pupil to the acquisition of knowledge, for the purpose of retaining and using it. Page 40. The third consists in the disciplining of her pupil in the practical use and proper application of the knowledge received, by which means the knowledge itself becomes better understood, better remembered, and much more at the command of the will than it was before. And her fourth educational process consists in training her pupil to acquire facility in communicating by language, his knowledge and experience to others. The first of these four general departments in nature's educational process is the development and cultivation of the powers of her pupil's mind. This part of nature's work begins at the first dawn of intelligence, and it continues through every other department of her educational process. For several months during infancy, sensation itself is but languid. The first indistinct perceptions of existence gradually give place to a dreamy and uncertain consciousness of personal identity. Pain is felt. Light is perceived. Objects begin to be defined and distinguished. Ideas are formed. And then, but not till then, reflection, imagination, and memory are gradually brought into exercise and cultivated. It is the extent and strength of these faculties, as we shall afterwards see, that is to measure the educational progress of the child, and therefore it is that the first object of nature seems to be to secure their proper development. The child feels and thinks, and it is these first feelings and thoughts, frequently repeated, that enable it gradually to extend its mental operations. It is in this way only that the powers of the mind in infants are expanded and strengthened, as there can be no mental culture without mental exercise. While a child is awake, therefore, nature prompts him to constant and unwearied mental exertion, by which means he becomes more and more familiar with external objects, acquires a better command over his own mind in perceiving and page 41, remembering them, and becomes more and more fitted not only for receiving constant accessions of knowledge, but also for putting that knowledge to use. The second part of nature's educational process, we have said, consists in her powerfully stimulating her pupil to the acquisition of knowledge. This, which we call the second part of nature's operations, has been going on from an early period of the child's history, and it acts usually in conjunction with the first. The training of her pupils to the practical use of their knowledge forms the third department in nature's educational process. This is the great end which the two previous departments were designed to accomplish. This is nature's chief object. All the others are obviously subordinate. The cultivation of the mind and the acquisition of knowledge were necessary, but that necessity arose from the circumstance of their being preparatory to this. Nature, in fact, appears to have stamped this department of her operations almost exclusively with her own seal, repudiating all knowledge that remains useless, and in a short time blotting it entirely from the memory of her pupils, while that portion of their acquired knowledge, on the contrary, which is useful and is put to use, becomes in proportion more familiar and more permanent. It is also worthy of remark that the knowledge which is most useful is always most easily and pleasantly acquired. The superior importance of this department of education is very observable. In the previous departments of nature's educational process, the child was induced to acquire new ideas. In this he is prompted to make use of them. In the former he was taught to know. In this he is trained to act. For example, if he has learned that his nurse is kind, nature now prompts him to act upon that knowledge, and he accordingly strains every nerve to get to his nurse. If he has learned that comfits are sweet, he acts upon that knowledge and endeavors to procure them. And if he has once experimentally learned, page 43, that the fire will burn, he will ever afterwards keep from the fire. Last of all comes the fourth, or supplementary step in this beautiful educational process of nature. It consists in gradually training her pupil to communicate the knowledge and experience which he has attained. It is probable that nature begins this part of her process before the child has acquired the use. But as it is by language chiefly that man holds fellowship with man, it is not till he has learned to speak that the mental exercise on which its success depends becomes sufficiently marked and obvious. It consists not in the acquisition of language so much as in the use of language after it has been gained. The pupil is for this purpose prompted by nature to think and to speak at the same moment, mentally to prepare one sentence, while he is giving utterance to its predecessor. That this is not the result of instinct, but is altogether an acquisition made under the tuition of nature by the mental exertions of the infant himself, is obvious from the fact that he is at first incapable of it, and never pronounces three, and very seldom two words consecutively, without a pause between each. This the child continues to do after he is perfectly familiar with the meaning of many words, and after he can also pronounce each of them individually. In giving utterance to the first words which he uses, there is an evident suspension of the mind in regard to everything else. His whole attention appears to be concentrated upon the word and its pronunciation. He cannot think of anything else and pronounce the word at the same time, and it is not till after long practice that he can utter two, three, or more words in a sentence, without hesitation and a decided pause between them. It is only by degrees that he acquires the ability to utter a phrase and at last a short sentence, without interruption. Nature prompts the child to this exercise, which from page 44, the first attempt, to the full flow of eloquence in the extemporaneous debater, consists simply in commanding and managing one set of ideas in the mind at the moment the person is giving utterance to others. This cannot be done by the child, but it is gradually acquired by the man, and we shall see in its proper place that this acquisition is entirely the result of a mental exercise. But as it is by language chiefly that man holds fellowship with man, it is not till he has learned to speak that the mental exercise on which its success depends becomes sufficiently marked and obvious. It consists not in the acquisition of language so much as in the use of language after it has been gained. The pupil is for this purpose prompted by nature to think and to speak at the same moment, mentally to prepare one sentence, while he is giving utterance to its predecessor. That this is not the result of instinct, but is altogether an acquisition made under the tuition of nature by the mental exertions of the infant himself, is obvious from the fact that he is at first incapable of it, and never pronounces 3, and very seldom 2 words consecutively, without a pause between each. This the child continues to do after he is perfectly familiar with the meaning of many words, and after he can also pronounce each of them individually. In giving utterance to the first words which he uses, there is an evident suspension of the mind in regard to everything else. His whole attention appears to be concentrated upon the word and its pronunciation. He cannot think of anything else and pronounce the word at the same time, and it is not till after long practice that he can utter 2, 3, or more words in a sentence, without hesitation and a decided pause between them. It is only by degrees that he acquires the ability to utter a phrase and at last a short sentence, without interruption. Nature prompts the child to this exercise, which from page 44, the first attempt, to the full flow of eloquence in the extemporaneous debater, consists simply in commanding and managing one set of ideas in the mind at the moment the person is giving utterance to others. This cannot be done by the child, but it is gradually acquired by the man, and we shall see in its proper place that this acquisition is entirely the result of a mental exercise. Thinking, the voluntary exertion of the powers of the mind upon the idea presented to it, and which we have denominated reiteration. 1. As perhaps best descriptive of that thinking of the presented idea over again, by which alone, as we shall see, the mind is cultivated and knowledge increased. It is also here worthy of remark that the cultivation of the powers of her pupil's mind, as a preliminary to their acquiring and applying of knowledge, appears to be a settled arrangement of nature, and one which must be rigidly followed by the teacher, wherever success is to be hoped for. Analogy, in other departments of nature's operations, proves its necessity and points out its wisdom, for she is never premature and never stimulates her pupils to any work till they have been properly prepared for accomplishing it. Hence the consistency and importance of commencing the process of education by expanding and cultivating the powers of the mind, preparatory to the future exertions of the pupil, and hence also the wisdom of requiring no more from the child than the state of his mental powers at the page 46 time are capable of performing. Our object at present is to discover the means employed by nature for accomplishing this preliminary object, that we may, by imitating her plans, obtain the greatest amount of benefit, in infancy, and during the early part of a child's life. Each of the thousands of objects and actions which are presented to its observation falls equally on the organs of sense, and each of them might, if the child had pleased, have become objects of perception as well as objects of sensation. But it is evident that till the mind occupy itself upon one or more of these objects, there can be no mental exercise, and, of course, no mental culture. On the contrary, if the mind shall single out any one object from a mass that surrounds it, shall entertain the idea suggested by its impression on the organs of sense, and think of it, that is, review it on the mind, there is then mental exercise, and, in consequence, mental cultivation. From this obvious truth, it necessarily follows that the cultivation of the mind does not depend upon the multitude of objects presented to the observation of a child, but only on those which it really does observe, which it looks at and thinks upon by an active voluntary exercise of its own powers. The child, no doubt, might have smelt every odor, it might have listened to every sound that entered the ear, and it might have looked upon every image that entered the eye, but we know that it did not. A few of them only were thought of. The ideas which they suggested were alone reiterated by the mind, and therefore they, and they alone, tended to its cultivation. As this act of the mind lies at the root of all mental improvement, during every stage of the pupil's education, it becomes a matter of considerable importance that its nature and mode of operation should be thoroughly understood. Let us for this purpose suppose that a lighted, page 47, candle is suddenly presented before a young infant. He looks at it. He thinks of it. His mind is employed with the flame of the candle in a manner quite different from what it is upon anything else in the room. All the other images which enter the eye fail to make an impression upon the mind. But this object which the child looks at, observes, does this, and accordingly, while it is passive as to everything else, the mind is found to be actively engaged with the candle. He not only sees it, but he looks at it. This, and similar reiterations of ideas by the mind, frequently repeated by the infant, gradually communicate to it a consciousness of mental power and enable him more and more easily to wield it. Every such instance of the reiteration of an idea, of the voluntarily exercise of active thought, strengthens the powers of the mind, so that he is soon able to look at and follow with his eyes other objects, although they are much less conspicuous than the glare of a candle. When we examine the matter a little farther in regard to infants, we perceive that all the little arts used by the mother or the nurse to amuse the child, as it is called, are nothing more than means employed to excite this reiteration of ideas by the mind. A toy, for example, is presented to the infant, and his attention is fixed upon it. He is not satisfied with passively seeing the toy, as he sees all the other objects in the room, but he actively looks at it. Nor is this enough. The toy is usually seized, handled, mouthed, and turned, and each movement prompts the mind to active thought, to reiterate the idea which each of the sensations suggests. These impressions are no doubt rapid, but they are real, and each of them has been reiterated, actively thought of, before they could either be received or remembered. And it is only by these impressions frequently repeated, in which the mind is vigorously and delightfully, page 48, engaged, that it acquires that activity and strength which we so frequently witness in the young. At a more advanced period during childhood and youth, we find the cultivation of the mind still depending upon the same principle. It is not enough that numerous objects be presented to the senses of the pupil, or that numerous words or sounds be made to vibrate in his ears, or even that he himself be made mechanically to utter them. This may be done, and yet the mind may remain perfectly inactive with respect to them all. Nay, experience shews that during such mechanical exercises, his mind may all the time be actively employed upon something else. There must therefore not only be a hearing or a reading of the words which convey an idea, but he must make the idea his own by thinking it over again for himself. Hence, it is that mental vigor is not acquired in proportion to the number of pages that the pupil is compelled to read, nor to the length of the discourses which are delivered in his hearing, nor to the multiplicity of objects placed before him. It is found entirely to depend upon his diligence in thinking for himself, in reiterating in his own mind the ideas which he hears or reads, or which are suggested to his mind by outward objects. This is still the same act of the mind which we have described in the infant, with this very important difference, however, that a large portion of his ideas is now suggested by words instead of things, but it is the ideas and not the words that the mind lays hold of and by which its powers are cultivated. When this act, therefore, is successfully forced upon a child in any of his school operations, the mind will be disciplined and improved. But wherever it is not produced, however plausible or powerful the exercise may appear to be, it will on scrutiny be found to be totally worthless in education, a mere mechanical operation, in which, there being no mental exertion, there can be no mental culture. Page 49. In the adult, as well as in the young and the infant, the culture of the mind is carried on in every case by the operation of the same principle. However various the means employed for this purpose may be, they all depend for their success upon this kind of active thought. This reiteration of the ideas suggested in the course of reading, hearing, observation, or reasoning. A man may turn a wheel, or point pins, or repeat words from infancy to old age, without his mind's being in the least perceptible degree benefited by such operations, while the millwright, the engineer, or the artist, whose employments require varied and active thought, cannot pursue his employment for a single day, without mental culture and an acquisition of mental strength. The reason is that in mere mechanical operations there is nothing to induce this act of reiteration, this active mental exercise of which we are speaking. In the former case, the individual is left to the train of thought in the mind, which appears to afford no mental cultivation, whereas in the latter, the mind is by the acts of comparing, judging, trying, and deciding, which the nature of his occupation renders necessary, constantly excited to active thought, that is, to the reiteration of the several ideas presented to it. These remarks may be thought by some to be exceedingly commonplace and self-evident. It may be so. If they be admitted, we ask no more. Our purpose at present is answered. If we have detected a principle in education, by the operation of which the powers of the mind are invariably expanded and strengthened, an effect which, so far as we yet know, in its absence never takes place. It is by means of this principle alone that nature accomplishes this important object, both in young and old. But its effects are especially observable in the young, where her operations not being so much interfered with, we find her producing by its means the most, page 50, extraordinary effects, and that even during the most imbecile period of her pupil's existence. In concluding this part of our investigation, we would very briefly remark that the existence of this principle in connection with the cultivation of the mind accounts in a very satisfactory manner for the beneficial results which usually accompany the study of languages, mathematics, and some other branches of education similar in their nature. These objects of study, when once acquired, may never afterwards be used, and will consequently be lost, but in learning them the pupil was compelled to think, to exercise his own mind on the subjects taught, to reflect, and to reiterate the ideas communicated to him, till they had been fully mastered. The mental vigor which was at first forced upon the pupil by these beneficial exercises remains with him, and is exercised upon other objects, as they are presented to his observation in ordinary life. The mind in commencing these studies gradually emancipates itself from the mechanical tendencies which an improper system of teaching had previously formed, and now gathers strength daily by this natural mode of exercising its powers. It is the effects of this kind of discipline that constitute the chief element of a cultivated mind. In this principally consists the difference between a man of liberal education and others who have been less highly favored. His superiority does not lie in his ability to read Latin and Greek, for these attainments may long ago have been forgotten and lost, but in the state of his mind and the superior cultivation of the mental powers, he possesses a clearness, a vigor, and a grasp of mind above others, which enable him at a glance to comprehend a statement, to judge of its accuracy, and, without effort, to arrange and communicate his ideas concerning it. This ability, as we have seen, can be acquired only by active mental exercise, and is not necessarily the result of extensive, page 51 reading, nor is it always accompanied by extensive knowledge. It is the natural and the necessary product of mental discipline, through which the above described act of reiteration, like a golden thread, runs from beginning to end. It is the fire of intellect kindled at first perhaps by classical and mathematical studies, but which now, collecting force and fuel from every circumstance of life, glows and shines, long after the materials which first excited the flame have disappeared. If then, as we formerly explained, the arts are to derive benefit from the investigations of science, we are led to the conclusion that the wisdom of the teacher will consist in taking advantage of the principle which has been here exhibited. He should not speculate nor theorize, nor go forward inconsiderately in using exercises, the benefits of which are at least questionable, but he ought implicitly to follow nature in the path which she has thus pointed out to him. One chief object with him should be the cultivation of the minds of his pupils, and the only method by which he can attain success in doing so has now been stated. He must invent or procure some exercise or series of exercises by which the act of reiteration in the minds of his pupils shall be regularly and systematically carried on. He must induce them to think for themselves and to exercise the powers of their own minds deliberately and frequently, in the same manner as we see nature operating in the mind of a lively and active child. When he can accomplish this, he will, and he must succeed. Whereas, if he allow an exercise to be prepared where this act of the mind is absent, he may rest assured that he is deceiving both himself and the child. The laws of nature are inflexible, and while she will undoubtedly countenance and reward these who act upon the principles which she has established. She will as certainly leave those who neglect them to eat the fruit of their own page 52 doings. But the pupil, more than the teacher, is the sufferer. Under the pure discipline of nature in the infant and the child, learning is not only their business, but their delight, and it is only when her principles are unknown or violently outraged that education becomes a burden and the schoolhouse a prison. We are led to the conclusion that the wisdom of the teacher will consist in taking advantage of the principle which has been here exhibited. He should not speculate nor theorize, nor go forward inconsiderately in using exercises, the benefits of which are at least questionable, but he ought implicitly to follow nature in the path which she has thus pointed out to him. One chief object with him should be the cultivation of the minds of his pupils, and the only method by which he can attain success in doing so has now been stated. He must invent or procure some exercise or series of exercises by which the act of reiteration in the minds of his pupils shall be regularly and systematically carried on. He must induce them to think for themselves and to exercise the powers of their own minds deliberately and frequently, in the same manner as we see nature operating in the mind of a lively and active child. When he can accomplish this, he will, and he must succeed. Whereas, if he allow an exercise to be prepared where this act of the mind is absent, he may rest assured that he is deceiving both himself and the child. The laws of nature are inflexible, and while she will undoubtedly countenance and reward these who act upon the principles which she has established, she will as certainly leave those who neglect them to eat the fruit of their own page 52 doings. But the pupil, more than the teacher, is the sufferer. Under the pure discipline of nature in the infant and the child, learning is not only their business, but their delight, and it is only when her principles are unknown or violently outraged that education becomes a burden and the schoolhouse a prison. Chapter 3. On the means by which nature enables her pupils to acquire knowledge. The second stage of the pupil's advance under the teaching of nature is that in which she prompts and assists him in the acquisition of knowledge. The importance of this department of a child's education has uniformly been acknowledged, so much so, indeed, that it has too frequently absorbed the whole attention of the teacher, as if the possession of knowledge were the whole of education. That this is a mistake we shall afterwards see, because the value of knowledge must always be in proportion to the use we can make of it. But it is equally true that as we cannot use knowledge till we have acquired it, its acquisition as a preliminary step is of the greatest importance. Our intention is at present to inquire into the means employed by nature for enabling her pupils to acquire, to retain, and to classify their knowledge, so that, by ascertaining and imitating her methods, we may in some degree share in her success. For some time during the early years of childhood, nature is the chief or the only teacher, and the contrast between her success at that time and the success of the parent or teacher who succeeds her is very remarkable and deserves consideration. When we examine this process in the case of infants, we see nature acting without interference, and therefore with undeviating success. Within a few, page 53 months after the child has attained some degree of consciousness, we find that nature, under every disadvantage of body and mind, has succeeded in communicating to the infant an amount of knowledge, which, when examined in detail, appears very wonderful. The child has been taught to know his relations and friends. He has acquired the ability to use his limbs and muscles and organs, and the knowledge how to do so in 100 different ways. He has become familiar with the form, the color, the texture, and the names of hundreds of articles of dress, of furniture, of food, and of amusement, not only without fatigue, but in the exercise of the purest delight and with increasing energy. He has begun to contrast objects and to compare them, and this capacity he evinces by an undeviating accuracy in choosing those things which please him and in rejecting those things which he dislikes. But above all, the infant, along with all this substantial knowledge, has been taught to understand a language and even to speak it. The fact of all this having been accomplished by a child of only 2 or 3 years of age is so common that the mysterious principles which it involves are too generally overlooked. We thoughtlessly allow them to escape observation, as if they were mere matters of instinct, and were to be ranked with the spider's catching its prey or the sparrow's building its nest. But the principles which regulate these different operations are perfectly dissimilar. In the case of a spider and the sparrow, there is no teaching and, of course, no learning. Their first web and their first nest are as perfect as the last. But in the case of the infant, with only 2 or 3 exceptions, there is nothing that he does and nothing that he knows which he has not really learned, acquired by experience under the tuition of nature, by the actual use of his own mental and physical powers. The benefits accruing to education, from page 54, successfully imitating nature in this department of her process, will be incalculable, not only in adding to the amount of knowledge communicated, but in the ease and delight which the young will experience in acquiring it. All must admit that the pleasure, as well as the rapidity, of the educational process in the young continues only during the time that nature is their teacher, and that her operations are generally checked or neutralized by the mismanagement of those who supersede her work and begin to theorize for themselves. The proof of this is to be found in the fact that although a child is much less capable of acquiring knowledge between 1 and 3 years of age than he is between 8 and 10, yet, generally, the amount of his intellectual attainments by his school exercises during the 2 latter years bears no proportion to those of the former, when nature alone was his teacher. In the one case, too, his knowledge was acquired without effort or fatigue, and in the exercise of the most delightful feelings. In the other, quite the reverse. That we shall ever be able to equal nature in this part of her educational process is not to be expected, but that, by following up the principles which she has developed and imitating the methods by which she accomplishes her ends, we shall become more and more successful. There can be no doubt. The method, therefore, to be adopted by us is to examine carefully the principles which she employs with the young through the several stages of her process, and then, by adopting exercises which embody these principles, to proceed in a course similar to that which she has pointed out. In prosecuting this plan, then, our object must be, first, to examine generally the various means employed by nature in the acquisition of knowledge by the young, and then to attend more in detail to page 55, the mode by which she applies the principles involved in each. These general means appear to consist of 4 distinct principles, which, for want of better definitions, we shall denominate reiteration, individuation or abstraction, grouping or association, and classification or analyzing. 2. The first is the act of reiteration, of which we have already spoken, as the chief instrument in cultivating the powers of the mind, and without which we shall also find there can be no acquisition of knowledge. The second is the principle of individuation, by which nature communicates the knowledge of single ideas or single objects, by constraining the child to concentrate the powers of its mind upon one object or idea, till that object or idea is familiar, or, at least, known. The third is the common principle of grouping or association, and appears to depend, in some degree, on the imaginative powers by which a child begins to associate objects or truths together, after they have become individually familiar, so that any one of them, when afterwards presented to the mind, enables the pupil at a glance to command all the others which were originally associated with it. The fourth is the principle of classification or analyzing, by which the mind distributes objects or truths according to their nature, puts every truth or idea, as it is received, into its proper place, and among objects or ideas of similar kind. This classification of objects is not, as in the principle of grouping, regulated according to their accidental relation to each other, by which the canary in the cage in which it is confined would be classed together, but according to their nature and character, by which the canary would be classified with birds, and the cage among other articles of household furniture. All knowledge, so far as we page 56 are aware, appears to be communicated and retained for use by means of these 4 principles, and we shall now proceed to examine the mode in which each of them is employed by nature for that purpose.